Colt Langston stood in front of the wooden fence, looking out over the long trail that stretched across the dry prairie. He had lived on this land for 4 years, building each pillar, each stone, hoping one day to share it with someone. The last letter he had received said that Margaret, a little schoolteacher from Kansas, would be arriving this week. A gentle, brown-haired woman who loved to read and dreamed of a quiet life with a good man. But the woman who stepped out of the old wagon was nothing like that image. Before we get into the story, tell us where you were when you heard this, and remember to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next episodes. She wore soft Apache leather pants. Her black hair was braided long past her shoulders, and on her hip was a pistol held securely in a dark leather holster. Her face was calm, her amber eyes fixed on Colt as if she knew him already. "Colt Langston?" she asked, her voice soft but clear. Colt nodded, feeling a chill run down his spine, despite the heat. "Are you Margaret?" "Yes," she said. But after a beat, her cold gaze shifted, scanning the field as if searching for something else. "I have the bracelet you sent as a token." She held out an old silver pendant with Colt's name engraved on the back. It was his. Colt tightened his grip on the shotgun by the door. Something was wrong. Margaret, in her letters, had said she loved teaching children, was afraid of gunfire, and dreamed of afternoon teas under the trees. The woman before him had the bearing of someone who had shot and killed. "You seem different from the description," Colt said slowly. "Letters can be misleading," she said, her eyes never leaving the trail. Colt felt uneasy. The strangest thing wasn't that she had a weapon, or that fierce look in her eyes. It was that she knew things no one but Margaret knew. Like the small scar on his left shoulder from a fall from a horse when he was 12. Like his habit of drinking strong black coffee every morning. Details no one but someone close to him, who had lived with him, could know. He took a half step back into the house. Intuition told him that this was not the woman he expected, and that she represented something more dangerous than the loneliness he was used to. A strong wind picked up from the west. As it blew, Colt noticed a dark red streak on the leg of her leather pants, a bloodstain that hadn't dried yet. Colt tilted his head slightly, his eyes fixed on the blood that had not yet dried on the pant leg of the woman who called herself Margaret. In the few years he had lived in this land, he had learned that fresh blood was never a good sign, especially when accompanied by a watchful eye and a pistol strapped to his hip. "May I ask whose blood is that?" Colt asked, his voice calm but his hand already sliding silently near the rifle propped up on the porch. The woman looked down at the red, then kicked her foot against the edge of the step as if it were dirt. "It's not mine," she answered, coldly simple, "and no one's worth regretting." Before Colt could react, her eyes narrowed, looking toward the distant hills. Her right hand lowered, sliding down to the butt of the gun, a reflex she had practiced for a long time. "Someone's coming," she said, not panicking, just reporting the weather. Colt turned his head to follow her gaze. Against the sunset, 3 horse silhouettes emerged, small as silent coal marks that grew larger. The riders were riding down the hill, fast and with a clear target. His ranch. He lifted his rifle to his shoulder, not taking his eyes off the figures. This was not the riding gait of a mailman or a passing stranger. This was the movement of a predator. "Your friend?" Colt asked, his voice sarcastic. "Depending on how you define that," she replied, drawing her gun, checking the chamber with frightening skill. Colt gritted his teeth. He might have invited trouble, but at the same time, there was something about the woman's posture that made it impossible for him to turn away. She wasn't huddled behind him like someone who needed protection. She stood beside him ready to fight. "What's your real name?" Colt asked, not taking his eyes off the approaching riders. She glanced at him, her gaze softening for a moment. "Ayoka," she said softly, a confession forced before blood was spilled again. "I am not Margaret. I only used her name to come here, because this is the last place I can lead them without harming innocent people." Colt tightened his grip on his gun. The 3 riders were nearing the fence. He still did not know who she really was. But one thing he was certain of: the men had not come to talk. The twilight slid across the horizon as the hooves stopped outside the wooden fence. 3 men in saddles wore dusty cloaks, guns at their hips, and their eyes were filled with hatred. The leader was the one with the scar that ran from his cheekbone to his left ear. His eyes were cold, never leaving Ahioka. "We don't want trouble," Colt said first, his voice low but firm. "This is my land. It's not you we're looking for," the scarred man said, his voice like stones scraping against metal. "Bring the Apache girl out." Ahioka didn't move. She was already behind the large water trough, the only place in the farmyard that offered adequate cover. Her hand was tight around her gun, her gaze calm, fearless, but somehow restrained. Colt looked at her. "Now I can ask for real. Who are you, anyway?" She didn't turn around, her eyes still on the three people outside. "I was a government courier, a sort of informant, but I knew too much. They wanted to silence me." "And Margaret?" Colt asked, his heart suddenly aching. "She was killed because she wouldn't tell me where I was. I found her in the woods, 3 miles from town." Ahioka's voice was low. "I buried her like a sister should." Colt's chest was pounding with rage. He didn't exactly love Margaret. He'd never met her outside of letters, but the idea of her dying for some kind of conspiracy made his blood boil. A whistle sounded in the distance, a strange tune like a signal. Just then, 3 figures appeared from the north, silent as the wind, through the clearing near the hill. They moved like ghosts, wild and deadly. Tala, her long hair in feathers, a wooden bow on her shoulder. Sheena, tall and silent, carried 2 curved blades at her back. Nayeli, the smallest, had a leather pouch across her chest, her eyes bright as an owl's. Ahioka smiled faintly. "They're here." Colt took a half-step back, surprised. "Are they?" "My sisters," Ahioka said. "We don't fight alone." The 3 riders outside noticed the change. They backed up their horses a little, starting to tense. Their initial confidence was cracked. Colt glanced at Ahioka. "You brought the war to my land, didn't you?" "No," she said, looking directly at him for the first time, unblinking. "I bring justice, but it needs a place to stand." Colt tightened his grip on his gun. He might not understand everything, but right now, he knew he was standing next to people willing to die for what they believed was right. The evening wind rustled across the prairie, carrying the scent of dust and something more insidious, the scent of guns about to be fired. Colt Langston stood still on the porch, his eyes scanning the Apache women as they prepared for what was clearly an unequal confrontation. Tala had climbed onto the roof of the barn, her bow drawn. Sheena was hidden behind a pile of wood, her hands clutching 2 sharp knives. Nayeli was crawling low under the fence, setting up hair-thin wire traps that could unseat a horse in a heartbeat. Ahioka remained in her original position behind the wooden water trough from which she had a commanding view of the yard. Colt stepped up to her, his rifle ready. "You told me part of the truth," he said softly. "And the rest?" Ahioka glanced at him, then turned back to watch the riders gathering outside. "I worked for a government intelligence agency that investigated the illegal cattle trade, but I found worse." "How much?" "They're making up stories, blaming the native tribes, especially the Apaches, that we were the ones raiding and killing people, when the truth is they were selling guns, stealing cattle, and splitting the profits with a few men in blue uniforms." Colt felt his chest tighten. He'd heard the rumors, but he'd always thought they were just fabrications to stir up the people. "They killed Margaret," Ahioka continued, her voice as quiet as ashes, "because she refused to snitch on me. I buried her with my bare hands." Colt looked her straight in the eyes. There was no lie in them, just pain and determination that was chilling. Suddenly, a gunshot rang out from outside. A bullet hit the post next to Colt, shattering the wood. Then came the sound of galloping hoofs. "They're charging," Tala shouted from the barn roof. Colt charged into position, while Ahioka returned fire with a shot that hit the lead horse in the hindquarters, sending its rider flying. Tala shot an arrow through the biceps of a man who was trying to jump the fence. Sheena didn't cry out, but swept like a panther, cutting down the man who had climbed over with a twist of her knife to the wrist. Nayeli signaled with a short whistle another man had fallen into the trap. "They're just the vanguard," Ahioka gasped. "Crandall isn't here yet. When he does, there won't be 3 of us." Colt reloaded, his eyes fixed on the scene before him. "Then we have to make him believe this is the last mistake he's ever made." Gunpowder smoke still hung in the air, as Colt dragged the horse's body out through the wooden gate. The front yard was covered in blood and dust, but the group was safe. The three attackers were down, one dead, two badly wounded. Tala and Nayeli tied them up, and Sheena stood still as a statue, staring off into the distance. Colt turned to Ahioka. We've repelled one group, but there will be more. I need the truth now. Ahioka nodded, her gaze sweeping over the bound men. The one with the scar, he worked for Crandall, an army lieutenant colonel. Crandall ran both a cattle and arms ring. He staged attacks, blamed them on the Apaches, and profited from lucrative military contracts. Colt clenched his fists. So he stole, he sold out, and he killed to cover his tracks? Yes. And he has allies in the government. Without proof, we're just barbarians fighting against the law. Tala stepped forward, placing an old leather map in front of Colt. This is something we got from a secret warehouse. It shows the route of the stolen cattle and the location of the weapons. It's enough to expose part of Crandall's network, Niley added, her voice low but sharp as an arrow. The point is, Crandall knows we have it. He'll chase us until we stop breathing. Colt looked at the three sisters, then at Ahioka. Their faces were dusty, their hair matted with sweat, but there was fire in their eyes, not the fire of blind hatred, but the light of those who refuse to yield. He took a deep breath. If he comes, he'll find me standing here. This ranch will be the front line. Sheena finally spoke, her voice as deep and hoarse as the night wind. You know what I mean? Standing with us means standing against not just Crandall, but also the men in blue at the court. Colt ran his hand over the worn wood of his rifle, then said simply, I've lived in the West long enough to know that when the bad guys have all the voices, silence is a sin. Ahioka looked at him longer than usual. Her amber eyes, usually sharp, softened. Then from now on, she said softly, you are no longer an outsider. A gust of wind picked up, stirring up dust on the trail. In the distance, the sound of horses' hooves came heavier and more numerous than before. Both Colt and the Apache warriors knew the storm was indeed approaching. As the moon rose, the distant sound of hooves echoed, steady and thick. Colt and the three Apache sisters sat silently in the darkness, guns and bows ready. But instead of a charge, the horses stopped outside the fence, and a deep voice rang out. Langston? Ahioka, don't waste any more bullets. I'm not here to kill tonight. Colt recognized the voice even though he had never heard it directly. Crandall, the man behind it all. He gripped his gun, his heart pounding. I have a proposition. Crandall continued, his voice booming across the prairie. Tomorrow, at sunrise, meet me at Devil's Rock. Bring Ahioka. In return, I'll spare this rundown ranch and your life. Langston. Tala shot a warning arrow from the barn roof, which landed just inches from Crandall's horse. The riders around him stirred, but Crandall only chuckled. Think about it. If not, I'll come back with a company. The sound of hooves faded, leaving a silence broken only by the chirping of crickets. Colt breathed heavily, turning to the Apaches. Devil's Rock. That's a narrow canyon with only one entrance. Perfect for an ambush. Yes. Ahioka nodded. He's not going to trade. He's going to bury us alive there. So what? Nayeli asked, still clutching the leather bag containing the map. If we don't go, he'll come back here. If he does, it could be a trap. Colt walked a few laps around the yard, his eyes on the dark mountains in the distance. There's another way, he said. An old trail that follows the creek to the south. I used to hunt deer there. If we go around, we might come right behind Devil's Rock. Sheena said in a low voice. Once you're in there, it's either advance or death. Exactly, Colt replied. But if we close in from behind, Crandall won't have time to react. He'll think I'm naive, and I'll prove him wrong. Ahioka put her hand on Colt's shoulder, her eyes stern. You know, if you follow this plan, you'll no longer be just a farmer guarding a farm. You'll be hunted with us, forever. Colt looked her straight in the eye. I may have been hunted the moment I opened the door to you, but at least I want to choose how I fight. There was a pause. Then Tala nodded, drawing back her bowstring. Then we'll prepare. Tomorrow morning, Devil's Rock will know blood. Dawn was breaking, painting the prairie a cold gold. Colt led the pack, with Ahioka, Tala, Shana, and Nayeli behind him. The trail along the ravine was narrow, rocky, and overgrown with weeds, but that was an advantage. No one expected anyone to dare take this path to Devil's Rock. The giant rock loomed in the desert, standing like a black horn thrust into the sky. Before the narrow entrance, silhouettes swarmed Crandall and nearly a dozen gunmen, their rifles glinting in the sunlight. On time, Crandall roared, his voice echoing in the ravine. "Bring her out, Langston, and you can go. Otherwise, you and that Apache nest will be white bones here." Colt hid with the group behind the cliff, watching. He had more men, better guns, more favorable terrain. But he didn't know that there was an opening behind him. Tala gave the signal, then climbed up a tall rock. Her bow was drawn, the arrows glistening. Nayeli stealthily dropped the wire traps along the ravine. Sheena held two blades, slithering like a leopard through the dark crevice. Colt put his hand on the butt of his gun, turned to Ahioka. "When I fire the first shot, we'll attack from both sides. You and Tala will take the left flank, Sheena and I the right flank. Nayeli will stay behind to hold the retreat." Ahioka nodded, her eyes shining. "This is the end." The sound of a gun going off was deafening. Colt's bullet went through the helmet of a guard, causing everyone to panic. Immediately, Tala fired 3 arrows, each one piercing the shoulder or leg of an enemy. Sheena rushed out of the darkness, her knife flashing, knocking 2 down in a flash. "Behind! They're behind!" One shouted, but it was too late. The melee broke out fiercely. Bullets whizzed by, rocks flying. Colt slid behind the boulder, returning each shot accurately. Ahioka charged through the gap, her pistol firing rapidly, her eyes blazing with hatred. Crandall roared, drawing his gun and pointing it at Colt. "Langston, who do you think you are, daring to fight me?" Colt pulled the trigger. The bullet grazed Crandall's shoulder, knocking him down, but not dead. He rolled into the gap, shouting orders to the rest of his men. "Kill them all. Leave no survivors." Nayeli let out a long howl from behind a danger signal. Colt turned, his heart pounding. Another cavalry charge was coming from the south, dust swirling in the air. "There are more of them than we thought," Tala shouted. Colt gritted his teeth, reloading. "There's no way back. This is where we have to stand." The cavalry poured down from the south, shaking the ground. Each hoofbeat was like a drumbeat, urging death to come closer. Colt shot one down and backed up against the cliff, his heart pounding. Without an escape route, they would all be crushed in the iron siege. Ahioka rushed to his side, blood dripping from her left arm but her eyes still shining. "I can't hold this position much longer. We must break through." Tala rained arrows down from above, each one as precise as a verdict. But the enemy were too numerous. The arrows could not drain their blood. Nayeli fired and let out a long howl, signaling that the trap was set. A row of horses collapsed when they stepped on the ropes, creating a short gap. Shana immediately rushed in, her knife swinging in a cold circle, cutting down 2 men and disappearing into the crevices of the rocks. Crandall emerged from his hiding place, his shoulder bleeding, but his face still twisted in a cruel smile. "Beautiful Langston, standing among a bunch of women and delusions of justice. You think you can change a whole country for a few pieces of paper?" Colt aimed his gun, his voice hissing through his teeth. "Not paper, Crandall. Truth." A shot rang out. The bullet grazed Crandall's ear, but he rolled into the ravine, shouting orders, "Burn it all. Leave only ashes." 2 men pulled the oil drum out and tossed it onto the sand. The flames leaped, clinging to the wind, red flames spreading into the crevice where Colt and the Apaches were hiding. "They're going to burn us alive," Nayeli shouted. Colt squinted, his mind spinning like a wheel. Then he caught sight of a crack in the cliff, face narrow, but possibly an escape. "There's a way out. Cover me." Ahioka fired 2 shots, forcing the enemy to raise their heads and dodge. Sheena rushed forward, pulling one down with her knife, clearing a path for Colt. He charged forward, using the butt of his gun to smash the rubble blocking the way. After a few tense beats, the crack opened just enough for each of them to squeeze through. Tala jumped down from the rock roof, blood on her cheek but still holding her bow tightly. "Go. I'll block behind." Colt tried to protest, but Tala's steely gaze silenced him. She drew her bowstring, standing tall against the sea of fire, and the approaching cavalry, like an unyielding shadow. Ahioka pulled Colt away, her voice breaking in the wind and fire. "She's chosen. Go." The group squeezed through the crack in the rock, leaving behind the screams, the sound of gunfire, and the red light of blood and fire. As they exited the mountainside, Colt looked back. The last image he saw was Tala's proud silhouette standing on the cliff, the last arrows leaving his hand, and then the fire consuming everything. The smoke of Devil's Rock still billowed behind them as Colt, Ahioka, Sheena, and Nayeli emerged from the ridge. They staggered along the narrow crevice, their lungs burning with smoke. Tala's loss stabbed like a dagger into each of their hearts, but there was no time to mourn. Nayeli stumbled, almost falling into the crevice. Colt pulled her up. Tears streamed down her ash-stained cheeks. She's still in there." "No," Sheena said, her voice low and hoarse, her eyes red. "Tala chose. She stayed so we could get out. If we fall now, her deaths will be in vain." Ahioka struggled to stand, the wound on her hand bleeding through her cloth. Her eyes looked away, only forward. "We still have evidence. We still have a chance to overthrow Crandall. Tala won't die for me to give up." Colt looked at the three, filled with pain but also with a steely resolve. He had never thought he would stand in this line a rancher among Apache women. But here, amid the blood and ash, he understood. They were not fighting for themselves, but for a greater truth. They stopped at a ravine, with a small stream. Nayeli knelt and pulled a small leather pouch from under her shirt. She pulled out the crumpled paper and handed it to Colt. "This is a copy of the map. The original was given to me by Tala. She knew this day would come." Colt opened it. The symbols, the seals, the signatures of Crandall and his men were clearly visible. This was something that could tear down a web of corruption. He held it tight, feeling like he was holding the beating heart of a fallen person. Sheena spoke in a deep voice, humming an Apache funeral song. The sound echoed off the cliffs, like the wind, like the silent cry of the earth. Nayeli joined in, whispering, tears streaming down her face. Ahioka put her hand on Colt's shoulder. "Don't look at us as lost. Look at us as survivors, for it is the survivors who can write the truth." Colt nodded, his voice hoarse. "I promise, this truth will not be buried with Tala." Up above, the sun was obscured by smoke, a blood-red light staining the sky. And down in the ravine, among the survivors, a new oath was sworn, an oath that death would not be in vain, and justice would no longer be bought and sold by the strong. The desert wind cut through the narrow canyon, carrying with it the sharp scent of dust and old blood. Colt Langston rode at the head of the group, his eyes narrowed against the sun as he scanned the horizon. Tucson was 3 days away. 3 days on a map. It seemed short, but on this land, every mile could be a trap, every shadow a grave. Behind him, Ahioka kept her horse steady, her left arm bound tightly with a strip of cloth already stained dark with blood. Sheena rode silent as ever on the left flank, her gaze sweeping across the ridges with the focus of a hawk. And Nayeli, the youngest, sat slumped forward in her saddle, clutching the worn leather journal to her chest, the copy of the evidence that Tala had entrusted to her before the flames at Devil's Rock. Each carried their own burden. Each knew the same truth: move forward or die. The road to Tucson was cruel. The sun blazed overhead, turning the sand into a searing floor that reflected heat back into their faces. The wind offered no relief. It only lashed them with dust that stung their eyes and coated their tongues with grit. Colt had lived long enough in these lands to know their moods. He had seen the desert as a silent companion, sometimes even as a friend. But today, he saw it as an enemy. Alone, he could have endured. But now, with 3 women under his protection, the land itself seemed eager to break them. He reined in his horse and crouched low, his eyes narrowing at the ground. The earth was marked, fresh hoofprints deep and heavy. Not wild horses, not travelers, armed riders. Sheena slid down from her saddle without a word. She knelt, touched the imprint, then brought the dust to her nose. 4, maybe 5, she said quietly. They ride fast, and they carry rifles. Crandall's men, Ahioka muttered, her jaw tightening. Colt straightened. They've already taken the direct road to Tucson. If we ride straight, we'll ride straight into their rifles. Nayeli's voice trembled as she looked up from her journal. We can't turn back. More of them will be behind us. If we hesitate, we'll be trapped between two fires. Colt nodded grimly. There's another way. Santa Rita, an old trail that runs along the creek, adds a day to the ride, but it's our best chance. Sheena studied him with her steady, unreadable gaze. And if you're wrong, then we die sooner. Colt answered flatly. But if I'm right, we'll have a chance to see Tucson alive. That night they found shelter in a narrow alcove of stone where water trickled from a crack in the wall. They lit a fire so small it barely warmed their hands, shielding the smoke with rocks. No one spoke for a long time. Colt sat with his back to the stone, rifle across his knees, watching the stars wheel overhead. He was used to nights like this, lonely, cold, silent, but now he heard the quiet breaths of Nayeli as she slept, the rasp of Sheena sharpening her blades, and the soft, pained sighs of Ahioka tending to her wound. She came to sit beside him, her face pale but her eyes steady. You don't need to be here, she said softly. This isn't your fight. Colt turned toward her, taking in her features and the firelight dust on her cheekbones, weariness in her shoulders, yet still the defiance that had kept her alive this long. It became my fight the moment Margaret was killed, he said. And since Tala fell, there's no walking away. The price has been paid. I'll see it through. For the first time, Ahioka's lips curved in a faint smile, one without bitterness. If we live through this, would you lay down your rifle? Plant corn beside me instead of carrying steel? Colt chuckled quietly, though the sound held more sadness than mirth. I never liked the rifle, but I've always known when to keep it close. And if I had someone to plant corn with, why the hell not? Silence settled between them, but it was no longer the silence of strangers. It was the silence of two people who had seen death together and dared to imagine something beyond it. Before dawn, Nayeli opened her journal. Her small hands moved quickly, scratching words into the pages. What are you writing? Colt asked, his voice low. She hesitated, then whispered. A record. If we don't reach Tucson, at least the truth won't die with us. This book can outlive me. Colt placed a hand gently on her shoulder. No one else dies for this. Tala already gave her life. We can't waste her sacrifice. Sheena's knife flashed in the dim light as she tested its edge. Sacrifice is part of war, she said. Fear it too much, and you lose everything. Colt looked at her, seeing the fire hidden in her calm. Maybe so, but if I survive, I don't want survival to be the only thing I've fought for. I want it to mean something. Ahioka glanced at him sharply. Something flickered in her eyes, surprise, perhaps even hope. By the third day, the trail wound out of the Santa Rita Mountains. The air grew hotter, the land flatter, but Tucson was close. Just as relief began to stir, the thunder of hooves shattered it. Colt raised his fist, halting the group. From the shadows of a narrow pass, 5 riders emerged, rifles raised. Their leader smirked, yellow teeth flashing. Well, he drawled. Langston, the Apache bitch, and her little flock. Crandall wants her alive. The rest of you? Don't matter much. Colt stepped forward, rifle leveled. His voice was steady as stone. If you want her, you'll ride through me first. The outlaw sneered. We've got 5. You've got 4 and one of you's already bleeding. You sure you want to die today? Sheena moved before anyone could answer. Her blade flew like lightning, sinking into the man's shoulder. Chaos exploded. Colt's rifle cracked, dropping one rider. Ahioka fired 2 shots in rapid succession, forcing another to reel back. Nayeli, trembling but fierce, squeezed her trigger, the shot sparking against the canyon wall and sending another horse into panic. The fight was brutal and short. When the dust cleared, 2 outlaws lay dead. One writhed on the ground clutching his wound, and 2 had fled, their shouts fading into the distance. Colt wiped blood from his cheek, chest heaving. They'll be back, with more. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in crimson, the 4 survivors emerged from the mountains. In the distance, through the haze of heat, lay Tucson's small wooden roofs, a federal flag fluttering above the courthouse. To Colt, it was more than a town. It was a chance. Perhaps their only chance. Nayeli clutched the journal to her chest, whispering, Tala, can you see? We're almost there. Ahioka rode beside Colt, her voice low but steady. If we deliver the proof, Crandall will stand trial. But law bends easy in these lands. What if they turn their backs? What if the law serves him instead of us? Colt's grip tightened on the reins. Then at least the truth will be spoken. And I'll stand in front of any judge, any jury, and swear it with my life. Sheena, as always, spoke little. But her words, rough as gravel, carried weight. If Tucson refuses the truth, then we carry it elsewhere. But today, we try. We try, or Tala's blood is wasted. The sun sank below the horizon, the desert painted in red and shadow. Their silhouettes stretched long across the sand, four figures walking into legend, into fate. The road to Tucson lay open before them, and there was no turning back. 3 weeks after the Tucson trial, spring had begun to blow across the prairie. Crandall and his men were in jail, the web of corruption exposed. For the first time in years, the land felt a little peaceful. On the farm, Colt, Ahioka, Shina, and Nayeli replanted rows of young corn. The fence was stronger, the roof was repaired, and rare laughter rang out across the land that had been stained with blood. That afternoon, Sheena lit a fire by the stream, and Nayeli placed wildflowers around a clearing. They didn't say it, but they all knew it was a special day. Colt stepped out wearing the cleanest shirt he had left. In his hand, he held a polished silver chain, the same one Ahioka had given him when they first met. Ahioka appeared in a simple, soft leather dress, her hair braided and adorned with a few wildflowers Nayeli had picked. Her smile sparkled in the sunset, no longer as cold as when Colt first saw her. There was no priest, no church bells, just the wind, the earth, and the survivors. Colt placed the silver bracelet on Ahioka's hand, his voice low but firm. I don't promise wealth, but I promise a roof, a land, and a heart. Ahioka held his hand tightly, her eyes shining. I don't promise peace, but I promise to stand by you, fight and so that we will never fall alone. Sheena nodded silently, as if in testimony. Nayeli shed tears, but they were tears of joy. They shared a brief kiss under the red sunset sky of the steppe. It was not a lavish wedding, but a real union between a man who had lived in solitude and a woman who had lived by the knife and the run. They would no longer run. A few days later, as Colt closed the last fence, he turned to look at Ahioka sowing corn, her hair blowing in the wind. He whispered to himself, finally, I have roots. Overhead, clouds drifted slowly, as if sheltering a new beginning. In the quiet of that desert evening, the story of Colt, Ahioka, and her Apache sisters comes to rest not with the roar of gunfire, but with the softer sound of seeds being planted in good earth. From loss and betrayal, from ambushes in the canyons and trials in Tucson, what endures is not the memory of blood spilled, but the resilience of ordinary people who chose to stand together. Their battles remind us that justice is rarely won in a single day, and that trust, once given freely, can bind strangers more tightly than bloodlines. For many listening now, the echo may not be of rifles or hoofbeats, but of choices we face in our own lives. When do we fight? And when do we stay, nurture, and rebuild? What lingers most is not Colt's rifle raised against Crandall, nor the peril of Santa Rita's trails, but the image of a simple union at a ranch, witnessed by only a handful, built not on ceremony but on trust. In a world that often rewards the loudest or the strongest, their choice to root themselves in honesty and shared labor speaks louder than any verdict from a court. It recalls something many of us know from our own seasons of life, that the truest victories come not from conquering others, but from refusing to surrender what is decent in ourselves. As we reflect on this tale, it's worth asking, what are the fields we've been entrusted to tend, and who are the companions we choose to labor beside? For those who have walked through fire, whether in war, in family hardship, or in years of quiet endurance, there is comfort in knowing that meaning can be reclaimed, and that peace, though fragile, can take root even in scarred ground. So tonight, perhaps take a moment to let this story settle into your own heart. Consider what it says about courage, trust, and the quiet work of building something worth keeping. And if this story has spoken to you, think about passing that warmth along, Share it with someone who might need encouragement, and if you'd like to support more stories like this, a simple like, a share, or a subscription helps keep the fire lit. Because sometimes, in a land that has seen too much dust and blood, the most powerful legacy is not the battle won but the garden planted.